Look, ma'am, it's complicated. You just don't understand cars like we do. The mechanic, a kid half my age with more hair gel than sense, chuckled as he said it, a smirk playing on his lips. He was trying to sell me on $1,000 of repairs I knew I didn't need. He saw a gray-haired woman in a sensible pair of shoes, an easy target. He didn't see the woman who had spent 30 years designing high-performance engines. And he certainly had no idea that the complicated engine he was trying to explain to me was my masterpiece, my legacy, and that I held the original US patent for it right in my handbag. This is the story of a mechanic who picked the wrong grandma and got a masterclass in automotive engineering he never saw coming. If you believe the best tool is experience, subscribe now and hit the notification bell, because you are about to witness the most satisfying engine overhaul in history. Part 1. The air in the service bay of the Newport Beach dealership smelled of expensive tire polish and freshly brewed espresso, a scent designed to soothe wealthy clients while their six-figure cars were being worked on. My car, a mint-condition 1995 Sterling RX-8, sat gleaming under the fluorescent lights. It wasn't the newest car in the bay, but it was the most special. It was the last car I had worked on before I retired, and its engine was my baby. I was here because I'd noticed a subtle, almost imperceptible flutter in the fuel-to-air mixture when the engine hit exactly 4,200 revolutions per minute. It was a tiny flaw, something 99.9% of drivers would never notice. To me, it was a discordant note in my favorite symphony. The service advisor, a young man named Chad whose name tag was crooked, sauntered over, wiping a spot of imaginary grease from his hands. "All right, Mrs. Reed," he began, his tone dripping with a patronizing warmth that set my teeth on edge. "So we ran the diagnostics. Good news is, the engine is basically fine. But you've got some significant wear and tear on the primary fuel injector assembly. It's a common problem with these older models. We're going to have to replace the whole unit. It's a big job." He pointed to a line item on his tablet. The price was astronomical. It was also a complete fabrication. The fuel injectors on the Reed Vortex V8 were designed to last for 500,000 miles. Mine had 60,000. I peered at the tablet. "That's interesting," I said, my voice calm. "Because the flutter I'm sensing feels more like a calibration issue in the electronic control unit, possibly a sensor misreading the O2 levels at high RPM. Chad actually laughed. It was a short, sharp, barking sound. "Whoa, okay there, speed racer," he said with a wide, condescending grin. "Look, ma'am, it's a complicated piece of machinery. Lots of moving parts. You just don't understand cars like we do. Let's just stick to the diagnostics, all right? We'll get your little classic running smoothly for you again." My little classic. The quiet, simmering anger I had felt for the past 10 minutes coalesced into a point of pure, cold resolve. For 40 years, I had fought battles just like this in boardrooms and on factory floors, my expertise constantly questioned by men exactly like this one, men who mistook my gender and my age for ignorance. I had thought those days were behind me. Apparently, I was wrong. I looked him dead in the eye, my expression unreadable. "Fine," I said softly. "Before we proceed, would you mind just walking me through the issue on the engine itself? I'd love to understand." He saw my agreement as a victory. He had no idea it was a declaration of war. Will this heartless condescension lead to a shocking karmic reckoning? This story of a hidden genius is just getting started. If you're hooked by this story of karma, subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapter. Part 2. My name is Evelyn Reed, and I am a ghost. In the world of high-performance automotive engineering, a world dominated by men with loud voices and grease-stained hands, I was a quiet, relentless force. I started my career in the late 1970s in Detroit, one of a handful of women in a sea of men. I outthought, outdesigned, and outworked all of them. My masterpiece, the engine in my Sterling RX-8, was the culmination of my life's work. It was the Reed Vortex V8, the first production engine to feature my patented cyclonic fuel injection system and a variable geometry turbocharger that was a decade ahead of its time. It was a legend among car enthusiasts, praised for its power, its efficiency, and its distinctive throaty roar. I was the E. Reed on the patent, a name that was revered by a small knowledgeable few, and completely unknown to the wider world. After I retired, I moved to a quiet corner of Orange County to be near the ocean, content to be anonymous. Chad, the mechanic, was a product of a different, more superficial era of California car culture. He was not a true engineer, he was a tech. He was certified to replace parts on a specific list of models. He learned his trade from watching YouTube videos and following diagnostic flowcharts on a tablet. He was fluent in the language of upselling, of finding the most expensive solution to the simplest problem. He saw an older woman and his training kicked in. She was an easy mark. He represents a new generation that has access to infinite information but possesses very little deep knowledge. He had no reverence for the history of the machines he worked on. They were just interchangeable collections of parts, opportunities to bill for hours. Our two worlds were set on a collision course in that pristine white-tiled service bay. It was the world of deep, hard-won, analog expertise versus the world of shallow, algorithm-driven, digital service. He saw a customer to be managed. He had no idea he was speaking to the creator, the primary source, the woman who knew more about the machine in front of him than he could ever learn from 1,000 tutorials. What is this hidden patent that could change everything? Part 3. Chad led me over to my car with the swagger of a professor about to lecture a particularly slow student. He popped the hood, revealing the gleaming, complex heart of the RX-8. Okay, so he began, pointing vaguely at the engine block. This whole unit here, this is your fuel injector assembly. As you can see. He trailed off, clearly not sure what to point at next. His knowledge was based on a diagram on a screen, not the physical reality of the engine. I decided to play his game. I see, I said, feigning confusion. So, is the problem with the solenoid actuators or the pintle valves themselves? Chad blinked. I had just used precise, technical terms he clearly didn't recognize. It's the whole assembly, he stammered, recovering slightly. It's an integrated system. That's fascinating, I continued, my voice still light and curious. Because I was under the impression that the Reed Vortex V8 used a modular injector design, which would allow for individual component replacement. Did Sterling change that in the later production models? The conflict was escalating. I was systematically dismantling his facade of expertise with my own, disguised as innocent questions. His primary obstacle was his own ego. He couldn't possibly admit to an old woman that he didn't know the answer. Other mechanics in the bay began to notice the strange interrogation. They saw their top tech, the cocky guy who always hit his service quotas, being quietly and methodically cornered by a grandmother. So, I pressed on, what kind of pressure readings were you getting from the fuel rail? Was it fluctuating outside the standard 40 to 60 psi range? He was sweating now. He had no idea. He had just plugged a computer into the port and it had spit out a code. He had never actually run a manual pressure test. The diagnostics indicated a fault in the system, he said, falling back on his jargon. Then, he made his final, fatal mistake. Desperate to reassert his authority, he pointed to the turbocharger. Part of the problem is this too. It's a known factory defect on these models. The turbine bearings wear out prematurely. We should replace it while we're in there. A known factory defect. He was insulting my work. He had no idea who he was talking to. Will a secret from the past turn the tables? Part 4. The accusation of a factory defect was what truly sealed his fate. My vengeance was no longer just about his condescension, it was about defending my professional honor. The ticking clock in this drama was the impending arrival of the dealership's general manager, a man named Frank Peterson. Frank was an old colleague of mine from my days in Detroit. He was one of the few who knew who I was, and he revered my work. He was at a conference in San Diego and was due back the next afternoon. I knew that once Frank was here, the problem would be solved instantly. But I didn't want the problem solved by a man. I wanted to solve it myself. I had until tomorrow to execute my plan. A crucial subplot was the dealership's reputation. This specific service center was one of only a handful in the country that was a certified heritage center for classic Sterling models. It was a prestigious and highly profitable designation, awarded by the manufacturer based on their expertise. Chad's incompetence and his attempt to scam a customer were a direct threat to that certification. The complexity of the situation deepened. This wasn't just about one bad mechanic, it was about the potential for a systemic failure in the very place that was supposed to be the guardian of my legacy. I knew I needed proof. I discreetly turned on the voice recorder app on my phone, which was in my jacket pocket. I asked him to repeat his diagnosis, specifically the part about the factory defect. He did, with a renewed sense of confidence, happy to be back on what he thought was solid ground. He was digging his own grave, and I was quietly, diligently recording the sound of the shovel. But will the next event shock everyone? Part 5, a factory defect, you say? I asked, my voice still deceptively mild. That's very serious. You must be absolutely sure. Oh yeah, Chad said, puffing out his chest. We've seen it a dozen times. The engineers who designed this, they just didn't account for long-term wear. This was the moment. The final insult. He had not just lied, he had slandered my life's work. I reached into my large, practical handbag. The other mechanics were openly watching now, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. Chad watched me, a smug look on his face, probably assuming I was getting my credit card. I didn't pull out my wallet. I pulled out a long, cylindrical cardboard tube. I unscrewed the end and carefully unrolled the contents onto the clean surface of a nearby toolbox. It was a large, beautifully detailed technical drawing, a blueprint, its lines faded to a soft blue from age. It was the original hand-drawn schematic for the Reed Vortex V8 engine. Chad stared at it, a confused frown on his face. What's this? This, I said, my voice losing its gentle quaver and gaining a new, hard authority, is the design for the engine you're working on. I drew it myself, in the spring of 1989. I pointed a steady, unwavering finger to the small, neat signature in the title block at the bottom right corner. E. Reed. The turning point was the look in his eyes as he read the name, a slow-motion explosion of pure, unadulterated horror. His brain struggled to connect the signature on the blueprint with the gray-haired woman standing in front of him. But the final crushing blow was yet to come. I reached back into my handbag and pulled out my tablet. I swiped the screen and turned it to face him. Displayed in crisp, high-resolution PDF was the official cover page of United States Patent Number 4,917,063. Internal combustion engine with cyclonic fuel injection system. And under the heading Inventor, in bold black, undeniable letters, Evelyn Reed, Detroit, Michigan. I looked him dead in the eye. The entire service bay was silent. So, I said, my voice as cold and precise as a micrometer. You were saying something about a factory defect? Please, enlighten me. As the factory, I'm dying to know. How will this shocking secret change their lives forever? This incredible twist has you hooked? Subscribe now for more stories of delicious karma. Part 6. Chad's face went from tan to a pasty sickly white. The tablet in his hand slipped, clattering onto the concrete floor. The service manager, a man named Henderson, came rushing over, his face a mask of panic. He had seen the patent, he had heard my last statement, and he understood instantly the magnitude of the disaster that had just unfolded in his service bay. Ms. Reed, Henderson stammered, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. I had no idea. I am so sorry. He turned on Chad, his voice a low, furious hiss. You're fired. Get your things. Get out of my sight. Chad just stood there, paralyzed, a deer in the headlights of his own catastrophic failure. The immediate consequence was a complete and total realignment of the power structure. I was no longer a customer. I was an icon, a legend, and a massive, terrifying liability. The repercussions spread through the dealership like a shockwave. Henderson got on the phone, presumably to the owner, his voice a low, desperate murmur. The other mechanics looked at me with a newfound, almost fearful reverence. The news that the Evelyn Reed was here, and that their top tech had tried to scam her, was the biggest event in their professional lives. My reaction was to shift from defense to offense. I was not content with one mechanic's firing. I'd like to see your diagnostic reports for the last 6 months on all RX-8 models, I said to Henderson, my voice leaving no room for argument. And I want to inspect your calibration equipment for the fuel injection system. Personally. I had been insulted, and now I was going to conduct a full, unscheduled audit of their entire operation. Will they overcome this new challenge? Part 7. The next few hours were a blur of frantic, terrified compliance. They gave me a clean workshop coat and full access to their diagnostic bay. I spent the afternoon inspecting their equipment and reviewing their service records. What I found was a pattern of incompetence. Chad wasn't an anomaly, he was a symptom. The dealership was consistently overcharging and misdiagnosing issues with the older, more complex engines, simply because their younger techs were not properly trained. My growth in this chapter was the shift from personal vengeance to a sense of professional responsibility. The challenge was no longer about punishing one arrogant young man. It was about protecting my legacy. My engines, my beautiful, powerful engines, were being mistreated, and their owners were being scammed. My anger transformed into a new sense of purpose. I had to fix this. When Frank Peterson, the GM, finally arrived late that afternoon, having driven back from San Diego at speeds that were likely illegal, he found me in his service bay, covered in a light sheen of grease, lecturing his master technicians on the proper way to balance a turbocharger. He walked up to me, his face a mixture of profound embarrassment and genuine delight. "Evelyn," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Of all the service bays in all the world, you had to walk into mine." "Your tech told me I had a factory defect, Frank," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "I'm here to fix it." My transformation was complete. I was no longer a retired ghost. I was Evelyn Reed, chief engineer, and I was back on the job. But what awaits them in the next confrontation? Part 8. The final confrontation was not with Chad, who was already a distant, pathetic memory. It was with the dealership's owner, a slick, bottom-line focused businessman named Mr. Sterling, no relation to the car company. He flew in from his home in Aspen the next morning for an emergency meeting. Frank and I met him in the main boardroom. Sterling was in pure damage control mode. He started the meeting by sliding a blank check across the table towards me. "Ms. Reed," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "On behalf of our entire organization, I want to apologize. Please, tell me what it will take to make this right." He expected me to write down a number. He thought this was about money. I had prepared for this. I pushed the check back across the table. "I'm not interested in your money, Mr. Sterling," I said. "I'm interested in competence. I'm interested in my name." I then slid my own document across the table. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a proposal. The tension in the room was thick. They had expected a settlement. They were being presented with a revolution. The final confrontation will reveal everything, won't it? Part 9. Mr. Sterling picked up my proposal, a confused look on his face. Frank leaned in to read it as well. It was a detailed multi-page plan. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "The Reed Legacy Initiative, a proposal for a master technician training and certification program." I laid out my vision. The dealership would invest in a new, state-of-the-art diagnostic wing, dedicated solely to vintage high-performance engines. They would fund a scholarship program for promising young female mechanics from community colleges. And I, Evelyn Reed, would personally design and lead a new intensive training program. Any technician who passed would be a Reed-certified master technician, the highest level of certification in the industry. I would not be a paid employee. I would be a consultant, with full autonomy over the program, and a percentage of the service revenue from the new wing would go to my scholarship foundation. The climax was their reaction. Sterling, the ruthless businessman, read the proposal, and I saw a slow, brilliant smile spread across his face. He wasn't seeing a problem anymore, he was seeing a massive, unprecedented marketing opportunity. He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with a newfound respect. "This is brilliant," he said, his voice full of genuine admiration. "Absolutely brilliant. We're not just fixing a mistake. We're turning it into a legend. Home of the Reed Legacy Initiative. I love it." My vengeance was complete, and it was better than I could have imagined. I hadn't just gotten an apology. I had leveraged an insult into an institution. I had turned a moment of condescension into a lasting legacy of education and excellence, funded by the very people who had allowed the incompetence to fester. The Reed Legacy Initiative was launched 6 months later to massive industry acclaim. The dealership became a pilgrimage site for owners of classic performance cars from all over the country. Their service revenue tripled. My scholarship program sent its first 3 talented young women to a top automotive engineering school. The long-term consequence for the dealership was a new identity. They were no longer just a luxury car seller, they were the guardians of automotive history. The emotional resolution for me was the discovery of a new passion. Teaching, mentoring, passing on the knowledge I had spent a lifetime acquiring, was more fulfilling than any engine I had ever designed. I had found a new purpose, a new way to engage with the work I loved, and a new community. I had turned a moment of infuriating disrespect into the most meaningful project of my life. A year later, I was standing in the immaculate new training bay, watching one of my first scholarship winners, a brilliant young woman named Maria, expertly diagnose a complex engine problem that had stumped everyone else. She looked up at me, her eyes shining with pride and excitement. "I think I found it, Ms. Reed," she said. I smiled. My work, my name, my legacy, it was all in very good hands. Have you ever been on the receiving end of condescension, where someone assumed you knew nothing about a topic you are passionate about? This story is a powerful reminder that expertise is not defined by age, gender, or appearance. True knowledge is a quiet power. Share a story of a time you surprised someone with your expertise in the comments below. If this story of a legend reclaiming her legacy resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more emotional tales of well-deserved vengeance.